A young woman was found in her own apartment. Police began an investigation, but they were unable to find any clues. It took a full 40 years before a breakthrough was finally made in the case, but along with the truth, detectives also received new alarming facts. Robin Brooks was born on March 30th, 1960, in the state of Virginia. In her childhood, she moved with her family to the small town of Highland, located in the state of New York. Robin was a cheerful and sociable person, had many friends, and always knew how to find common ground with people. She also had an older sister, Mariah, with whom she was very close. After school, Robin decided to move to California. In addition to the state's climate attracting her, the young woman had another weighty reason to move. Shortly before that, her sister also went there, and Robin decided to follow her. The young woman rented an apartment in the city of Sacramento and got a job there. Several months later, she had the opportunity to move to a residential complex where her sister lived with her boyfriend. In addition to the fact that the apartments were very significantly better, Robin could spend more time with Mariah, and shortly before her 20th birthday, she decided to move. The young woman rented a separate apartment, and in order to pay the rent, she had to take 2 jobs. One of them was a cashier position at a donut shop located just a few meters from her residential complex. Robin chose the evening shift to combine it with her second job. The young woman lived in this complex for about 1.5 months, and during this time managed to make many friends both at work and beyond. She was also glad to have the opportunity to see her sister every day again. On April 24th, 1980, Robin was supposed to start her shift at the donut shop at 4 p.m., but to the surprise of her colleagues, she never showed up. This was very strange because during her time working there, she never missed her shifts and usually came even earlier than scheduled. The employees waited for several hours, and eventually, one of them decided to go to Robin's apartment. The colleague knocked on the door, but there was only silence in response. After several unsuccessful attempts, he returned to the store and told them that the young woman was not responding. Colleagues were deeply concerned about this fact, assuming that something may have happened to Robin. Otherwise, she would have called to report why she couldn't come to work. During the short time she spent in their store, she had become friends with all the employees, and they were genuinely worried about her. Colleagues considered calling the police, but quickly realized that law enforcement wouldn't search for Robin because of missing a work shift. Then one of them suggested a non-standard solution. He offered to open the entrance door to her apartment to check if everything was okay with her. He and other colleagues headed to her home. Colleagues knocked on the door for a few minutes and ultimately decided to break in. When they were successful, a shocking scene unfolded before them. Robin was lying on her waterbed in the living room, and everything around her was covered in blood. Colleagues immediately called the police, and arriving officers confirmed that the young woman was dead. Her body had numerous stab wounds, apparently inflicted by an unknown assailant who attacked her with a knife and punctured the water mattress several times, causing its contents to spill onto the floor. After examining the crime scene, the police established that the entrance door had no signs of a break-in until Robin's colleagues opened it. The back door was also locked from the inside, leading them to believe that the killer entered the apartment through a window. Soon, forensic experts found evidence of this theory by discovering fingerprints on the windowsill. Medical examiners determined that the victim had been sexually assaulted and obtained the perpetrator's biological material. The apartment also contained small traces of blood that did not match Robin's blood type. Detectives concluded that the killer had cut himself during the attack and the blood samples were sent to a laboratory. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not available in the 1980s, so they could not use this evidence. Investigators began interviewing acquaintances of the victim, starting with her colleagues. They said that the young woman had finished her shift at midnight the day before and went home. She was in a good mood, joking around, and generally behaved as usual. Nothing indicated trouble at that moment. Her colleagues added an interesting fact. That day, Robin mentioned that she had washed her bedding before going to work and was worried if it would dry before she returned. The bed in the victim's apartment was not made, leading detectives to conclude that the killer attacked her shortly after she returned home. Her sister also reported something troubling. A few days before her death, Robin mentioned that she was being followed by a man. She did not provide any details about this person that could help identify him, but she said he had come to her store several times and behaved strangely, trying to win her affection. However, he had not done anything to make Robin fear for her safety, so she did not take it seriously. The police were unable to identify this person because they had no characteristics to go on. They continued their investigation, talked to the victim's neighbors, but they did not have any leads. None of them heard any screams or sounds of struggle that night. The neighbors also did not see anyone unfamiliar visiting the victim. In addition, investigators learned that Robin did not go straight home from work that night. She went to a party with her friends for a while and left soon after. According to her acquaintances, she went home alone, and there were no conflicts or strange situations at the party. The police talked to everyone who was there and concluded that they were probably not involved in her murder. Ultimately, the detectives hit a dead end. They had no potential suspects. Robin got along well with her neighbors and colleagues. She had no boyfriend, and there were no people from her past who might have wished her harm. Blood and biological materials at the time could not lead them to the killer, and fingerprint matching against existing databases yielded no results. Investigators believed that the murderer was the persistent visitor to the store that Robin had mentioned. According to their theory, the man followed the victim from work to her home, learning her exact address. The next day, he broke into her apartment through a window while she was at the store and waited. When Robin came home, he attacked her, subjected her to violence, and killed her, then fled. Despite the complete lack of evidence, the investigation continued for some time until it ultimately stalled. It was only in 2004, 24 years after the murder, that the investigation was reopened. By that time, DNA analysis had become a widely used technology, and detectives hoped it would help them identify the killer. They sent blood and biological material to a laboratory where experts extracted a DNA profile and loaded it into the FBI database, but no matches were found. This meant that the killer had not been previously convicted of a serious crime, or that it happened before DNA collection was mandatory for such offenders. Despite this, a troubling discovery awaited investigators in the California State Database. The DNA profile of the killer matched another crime that occurred 3 weeks before Robin's death. At that time, an unknown man had entered another young woman's home, assaulted her, and fled, leaving the victim alive. It all happened at night, and the young woman did not see the attacker's face. She immediately called the police, and forensic experts were able to extract biological material from the man. Detectives tried to find new leads in this case to finally identify Robin's killer, but all of their attempts led them nowhere. Eventually, the case went cold again, and investigators were left periodically checking the DNA profile against databases in case the killer came into police view and his DNA was added there. This continued until 2017, when detectives heard about a new method called DNA phenotyping. Its essence is that genetics experts study a DNA sample and create an approximate portrait of the suspect based on their interpretation of the data obtained. This method is not precise and rather serves as an auxiliary guideline for police. With the help of such a portrait, investigators can look closely at similar suspects or exclude someone from the list. Detectives turned to Parabon Nanolabs, which conducted such research, and soon they prepared an approximate portrait of the killer. He turned out to be a man of African descent, but investigators could not find anyone similar among all the people who even remotely appeared in the case. Parabon Nanolabs prepared two portraits. One showed what the suspect might have looked like in 1980, and the other in 2017. Both images were posted in the media, hoping to get new leads. Relatives of Robin also had hope of finally finding out the truth, so they decided to offer a reward of $10,000 for any information about this person that would help find him. The police received several tips, but they all led nowhere. The identity of the real criminal remained a mystery to them. Despite this, investigators and Robin's relatives were not going to give up. In 2020, this case became one of the unsolved murders for which additional funding was allocated. By that time, a new DNA analysis tool was actively being used, which allowed even distant relatives of the DNA sample owner to be found. For this, at least one person related to him by kinship had to be in public or state DNA databases. The Robin killer sample was handed over to experts from Parabon Nanolabs, and they waited. It took them several months to study all possible relatives of this criminal, trace their genealogies, and finally find a suitable suspect. As a result, the detectives finally got a name: 71-year-old Philip Wilson. But the research results did not confirm his guilt. The police needed to take his DNA and compare it with the sample found in the victim's apartment. They learned the address of this man and began to monitor him. Considering that by law a person is not required to provide their DNA sample, the police have to resort to some tricks. They often try to get some item that the suspect has come into contact with. It can be a water bottle, a cigarette butt, and so on. Having obtained what they needed, investigators hand it over to experts who can extract the DNA sample. In Wilson's case, detectives also did the same. After obtaining an item with his DNA, they sent it to the laboratory. Experts found a complete match. 4 decades later, they finally found the probable killer, and on February 24th of the same year, he was arrested. The man denied his involvement in the murder, but the evidence spoke against him. The police also took his fingerprints, which matched those found on the victim's windowsill. Studying his biography, the detectives learned a lot of interesting facts. At the time of Robin's murder, the man was 31 years old and lived just a few streets from her complex. In addition, Wilson was a regular visitor to the donut shop where the victim worked. This confirmed the police's early theory that the killer was the same unknown stalker who bothered the young woman at work. The man had no serious criminal history, which explained the absence of his DNA and fingerprints in the databases. After his arrest, preparations for the trial began, which dragged on for several years. The process only began in 2022, and by that time, Wilson and his lawyers had prepared a new defense line. According to it, on that night, there was a consensual relationship between Philip and Robin, after which the man went home and someone else broke into the young woman's apartment and killed her. As for the suspect's blood found at the crime scene, his lawyer insisted that Wilson injured himself at work and the wound opened up when he was at Robin's home. The prosecution considered this version of events absurd. First of all, the victim was not in a romantic relationship with anyone. Moreover, she complained about a strange man who was stalking her at work, and that man was likely Wilson. The young woman was annoyed by his behavior and persistence, and there was no sympathy between them. Secondly, no other men's DNA traces were found in the victim's apartment. It would be strange to assume that Wilson left his biological material, blood, and fingerprint, while the killer left absolutely nothing. In addition, if we believe the suspect's lawyer, the young woman contacted him of her own free will, but before that, for some reason, she did not make the bed, which had no bedding. Wilson's defense also tried to point to another suspect who could have been the killer. It was Maria's ex-boyfriend, with whom she was living at the time. At the time of the trial, the man was no longer alive, and the lawyer used this fact. He tried to convince the jurors that the man was aggressive, threatened Robin and her sister, and also broke into the victim's apartment. However, nothing could be confirmed, so all these statements did not have a significant impact on the judicial process. As a result, Philip Wilson was found guilty of murder. His sentence was announced on his birthday. The man received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Currently, he is experiencing many health problems, so his time in prison is unlikely to be long. The victim's relatives thanked the detectives for finally bringing the case to a close. Her sister admitted that she still feels guilty. After all, Robin moved to California following her. As for the young woman who Wilson assaulted 3 weeks before the murder, the statute of limitations had expired for that crime, so the man did not receive any additional punishment for it. However, detectives still wonder, did Wilson have other victims? Usually, criminals who commit such horrific acts with a few weeks in between do not stop and continue to harm people. It's possible that Wilson did not plan to kill Robin. He broke into her apartment and assaulted her, but she saw and recognized his face because he had come to her store repeatedly. Fearing a prison sentence, the man may have decided to commit murder and then refrain from committing other crimes. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.